Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Your Voice, Our Morrisville. Today, we are continuing our conversation about the Morrisville Library, and joining us is Connie Beadle. Connie is a former Morrisville librarian and a retired school librarian, and she is currently on the library board. We also have Peggy Walsh, a council candidate, who is here to talk with Connie about the library and some of the challenges it is currently facing. So take it away, Peggy.
Well, once again, I have to offer a disclaimer because Connie and I have been friends for over 40 years, and she's one of those really smart librarians I talked about in the last podcast we did. And I first met Connie when she was the librarian for Morrisville. And I just wondered what your experience was like back at the time you were the Morrisville librarian in working with the board and the council.
Well, I was very lucky. My first library job was at Falsington Library, but at the time that the Morrisville librarian retired, I was home. It was right after the birth of my second son,
Doug.
so I was available. Yes, Doug. And I actually, the Morrisville librarian who was retiring had recommended me, and I got a call from the borough manager, who was Bob Stewart, and he asked me if I was interested, and I was, and I told him so. He hired me on the spot. The council approved, and that was it. It was the easiest job I ever applied for, and I loved it. I spent 4 years there. I was hired at 20 hours a week.
So when you worked with the council as the librarian, your primary connection or liaison was the borough manager and not the council president?
Yes, the borough manager was the president of the library board. So he attended every meeting and he met with me periodically. My first job, I had kept a budget, but I had never made the budget. And in this job, I worked on a budget with Bob Seward, and I had not done that before. So he was my mentor. He showed me how to estimate upcoming costs, how to navigate a budget, how to stay. Oh, I knew how to stay within a budget, but he did call me in one day and say, "You're over budget." And I'm like, I can't be. I've been watching this. And it turned out that I wasn't over budget, but I had not been looking at the other side, what money was coming in. And so we had fallen behind. I never made that mistake again. I learned a valuable lesson.
And how was the library staffed at that time? And we're talking, how many years ago is this?
This was 1980 or 81. Okay. I know this because my son was born in 1980, okay. October of 1980.
So how are you staffed now?
I was the quote head librarian. There was an assistant librarian, and there were 2 or possibly 3 clerks. I also had at least 5 volunteers who were able to work the desk 1 day a week, which was really helpful. And then I had some other volunteers who did other things in the library.
How many volunteers did you have? And what was your experience working with the volunteers? I know you had a pretty funny story about your volunteers.
Oh, yes. I can't remember. Volunteers tend to come and go because they're volunteers, they get jobs. Some we hired out of their volunteer slots and into staff. But I had at least 5 regulars. And then I had 2 or 3 who did special jobs. Like there were a pair of women who helped with the art projects that went along with Story Hour. There was no children's librarian. I did the children's activities. I loved Story Hour, but crafts is not my thing. So these ladies came in and they took care of the crafts part. Then I had this wonderful man who ran the film program. During the summer, we showed movies, and it was the 1980s. It was the old-fashioned reel-to-reel
Yeah.
projector.
Right. I remember trying to set them up.
And he ran it until I got comfortable with it. And then, we did it. And then Mrs. Arazi was the Justice of the Peace at that time. And when she had a juvenile who had done something wrong but wasn't like dangerous or anything, she often sent them to me. And my favorite was a young man, I forget his name now, but he was about 15 and he was very macho. And he was also very well built. How did I know this? Because he showed up at the library without a shirt all the time. and at first I was like, why won't you wear a shirt? And then I realized he didn't want to be seen in the library, and he knew if he was shirtless, I wouldn't put him out on the floor. So I found him jobs to do in the back and outside, and he was a perfectly good worker. One of my favorites.
So that was a creative way of dealing with it. I know after you left the Morrisville Library, you started a career working in school libraries as the children's librarian. And I know one of the things that I have heard from people, especially a council member, objecting to the children's librarian purchasing things like bubbles and rocks, paint for rocks. In your experience, are those kinds of purchases or inclusion like frivolous and I think some people think they have nothing to do with reading and helping children read.
Oh, well, it's motivation. It's positive reinforcement and motivation for reading and for participating in the library program. Wherever I've worked, I've always used some kind of prizes or gifts or little parties. Food always works with kids, and it's just something that helps kids to participate.
And I think sometimes it helps to extend a story.
Oh, yes.
When if there are bubbles in the story, then the kids do bubbles, and it's sort of a hands-on.
We used to make Play-Doh as part of fortunately, the ingredients for that, none of these things were expensive. And my favorite one was free. Somebody donated a stuffed animal. This is when I was in Morrisville. And part of giving out library books is getting them back. So I promised this stuffed animal would be awarded to the class that returned all their books, and they could keep it in their room for a week and then bring it back, and it would go on to the next class. And they loved it. And I thought it was the little kids would get the most excited. The ones who got most excited and worked hardest to get them back were the sixth graders. They loved getting that animal.
So positive reinforcement again really does work with everybody. Now you're on the board, the library board, as we talked about in the beginning. And what's been your experience with the current dynamic between the library board and Borough Council and Borough Manager?
It's been a little bit confusing. When I first came on the board, there was a council member, Nancy Sherlock, who was also on the board, and she was our liaison, and she came to every meeting and we communicated really well. After she left, we got occasional visits from council members, but we didn't have the same line of communication. Meanwhile, the borough had 2 different managers during my term, and the library changed, had staff changes also. So the communication has been a little tougher than I had it in the old days when I was the librarian.
And then there are some people in the community who seem to think that the current library has 40 to 80 volunteers. I've heard that floating around. And do they really? Because that would shock me.
I wish we had that many volunteers. to the best of my knowledge, we only have 2 regulars, and those are juveniles. Now, we are trying to establish a Friends of the Library, which would also help with our fundraising. But times are tough. It's difficult to get people. And like I said, a lot of people start volunteering and then it doesn't suit them, or they get paying jobs. So it's a constantly changing situation.
I think people are so busy these days with work and with children and families and jobs. It's really, life is hectic.
It is.
So it's harder to find enough volunteers.
That's why most of our volunteers are either seniors or juveniles, because they're the ones who have the time.
Okay. And then I've heard some discussion that since the library is a nonprofit, you could be raising your own funds to fund the library. And in your experience, I know you said that you're trying to do fundraising, but would that be adequate to be able to keep our current library going?
Oh, no, there's only 7 of us on the library board. Some are still working and some are seniors. I don't know how we could possibly raise enough money to support the library by ourselves. We do have 2 book sales a year. We do, is solicit the right word, encourage people to donate. And we've had a sale of art prints that went very well, but it's very difficult. There's an old library joke that says someday libraries will be fully funded and the Air Force will have to have a bake sale to buy a bomb. That is never going to happen.
That sounds like a librarian joke.
Definitely not funny to probably not funny to anyone else.
Okay. It sounds like you think it's really important for us to maintain the current library as we know it, that we heard in the last podcast, residents fought 120 years to establish, that we need consistent and dedicated funding, and we need to know what's coming in, and we need a clear budget so we know what the expenditures are and where it's going.
Absolutely, so that we can plan for what is, and that's another thing that Bob Stewart taught me, was to look ahead and say, if you want to start this new program, then you need to budget for it ahead of time. One final thing I want to say, I grew up in Morrisville and I couldn't wait to leave. I got out, I went to college, I lived elsewhere for a while. And when I came back, Morrisville hadn't changed, but I had. And now you and I share that love of Morrisville. But the reason I wanted out was because there wasn't enough to do when I was young. And I think it's even worse for today's kids. We don't have the pool anymore. We can't walk to a movie theater anymore. And so the library becomes even more important. And the children's programs, especially, I would love to see us start something for young adults, something like board games or trivia competition or something like that. But even if they're run by volunteers, you need materials, you need some money to get a program started.
Right.
So I really feel, and I feel that it benefits the town for our children to have some place to go, not to mention the adults who also use, I think the last count was we have 100 people a day on average coming in. Is that right?
I think the counter is showing that we have 1,000 a month. So at this point, but it's growing. So I'm not positive, but I think that's what I heard when I went to the council, the meeting that you had.
And the children's programs, which have been defunded not this year, but last year, bring in a huge number of children. And of course, their parents come with them. So you get a lot of positive reaction to that.
Right.
And it was the children's librarian, the one who's leaving, who was able to raise the money the year that the council did not fund the programs.
Okay. So one last question.
Yes.
I know that your parents were congregants of the Episcopal Church that's now the library building. And I think that your father played a role in actually assembling that screen that separates the fiction section from the rest of the library. And I know that screen is like called a rood screen when it's in a church, because rood means cross. Yeah. So it separates the sanctuary where the cross is from the rest of the congregation. So can you just tell us a tiny bit about that?
I think there's a whole story about it, but I was very young when this all happened, so I only remember the parts my father was involved with. The rood screen came from a church in England that had been bombed out during the Blitz in World War II. And they had somehow packed it all up, shipped it over here. My father was one of many parishioners who unpacked it, put it all together, and installed it in the church. Mm-hmm. And I remember hearing the stories, but I don't remember any of the details. But it felt very strange to me when I first started working in the library. I felt like I should genuflect every time I came up to that. And then one day, a man who had been my Sunday school teacher when I went to that church came in to the library, and he said, I was here when Father Mills desanctified the church. And so I didn't have to worry anymore.
You felt comfortable?
I was much more comfortable knowing it was desanctified.
So that's a great story. And if anyone in town knows any more about the origin of that rood screen, that would be just wonderful to know. And I know Bruce Stevens, who we talked to in the last podcast, would love to know about it too, because as you know, he's trying to get the library building certified as a historic building on the historic registry. So, Connie, I know that your term on the library board is up. And in fact, I think you served 2 terms on the library board.
Yes, my first term was a 1-year term. My second term was a 3-year term. And I've requested that the council will reappoint me for at least 1 more year. I feel like I have experience now. I know a little more than I did when I came onto the board, and I enjoy working with both the staff and the library board. So I'm hoping they'll.
Well, you're certainly more than qualified, so hopefully there will be no question, that you would be allowed to at least do 1 or 2 more years on the library board. So that's a great thing. And thank you very much for doing that. And I think there are a couple of other openings on the library board too.
There were 3 of us whose terms expired in March, and all 3 have asked the council to reappoint them.
Now that's really dedication. That's great.
So good to have institutional memory.
Yes.
And definitely not be turning the board over all the time.
Right. Well, thank you for sitting with me. We sit and talk a lot, but never quite so formally.
That's right.
Well, thank you, ladies. Thank you, Connie and Peggy, for really giving us even more history about the library and what's going on there right now. Between this episode number 3 and our previous one, episode number 2, we've covered a lot of different aspects about the library, its history, and its future. So thank you both again, and join us again on the next episode of Your Voice, Our Morrisville.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Connie, for doing this.
It was my pleasure.